So in your task of learning how to do art history, one of your very important focus points is learning how to use technical terms. And that's why we're looking at this beautiful anatomical drawing, an astounding work by Leonardo da Vinci in the 16th century, to illustrate why technical terms matter. So if you went to a physician and you said your shoulder hurts, and that person said, oh yeah, the bulgy part here, this bulgy, I get it, you got the bulgy hurt, that you would have no confidence. The kind of anatomical precision that started with the scientific revolution, where we can talk about the anterior deltoid, the posterior deltoid, we can talk about the pectoralis muscles and where they insert and how they relate to the clavicle bone. All of that requires very precise terminology. And that precise terminology allows you to know that the knowledge that you're constructing is very reliable. But that reliable precision with these authoritative terms, it's not easy to build that. It takes time, which is why I invited you to propose questions. One that came up for many people had to do with these very subtle differentiations in color characteristics, hue, value, intensity. And in my response here, one of the things I used was an image of ordinary paint store paint samples. So you could see how a pure hue at the bottom here, this orange, can get progressively lighter as you add more white. The same with the blue. The richest, purest color gets lighter with white, so it's not as intense, right? So that purest, deepest, richest example is the most intense, as we talked about in this discussion. This came up repeatedly, and one of the things that I put out there to clarify for some students who were thinking about how does color and value relate to this issue of light or dark, I put out here that color in everyday speech means red, blue, yellow, right? So when we say that, we're talking about hue. And then I clarified for some people who were not aware of this, that when you tint it, if you tint a color, you're lightening it, it means you're adding white. And the converse of this is if you shade it, you're adding black. You're darkening that color. There's another term, toning it. If you add gray to the color, it's going to be less pure, less intense, but it's not going to be shaded as deeply darkly as if you used black. So don't worry about making sure you get every one of these terms. Get a foundation and know that you can go back if you come to a passage in the reading or a video where you're confused, and you can revisit the definitions. Another very important conversation was launched by Kimberly. Thank you, Kimberly, in terms of dissecting what we mean by pictorial space, because that term can be used in somewhat different ways. So this is a really rich conversation where Tyler is talking about picture plane, foreground, middle ground, and background. I'm actually going to post this conversation because I want you to be thinking a lot about space. Pictorial space referring to the space within a two-dimensional field, like Jus d'Oz, or real space when you have a sculpture like this marvelous sculpture of a cherry on a spoon. And pictorial space is complicated because, as I explained in this discussion, you have the length and width, the two-dimensional space, but often, not always, often you will have an illusion of depth. So I talk about that in this section. So Jason demonstrates an excellent way of posing a question. He cites something very specific that the textbook author says, and then says, hey, it's not translating well for me. What they say is that pattern can deny perspective depth. When there's pattern in a pictorial space, perspectival depth is denied. So one of the reasons I love this question is I get to show one of my favorite artworks to explain it. This is from the Akbarnama, made for the great Mughal ruler Akbar in India in the 1500s to 1600s. And the point I make here is that these Mughal painters were very good at creating details that make things feel very lifelike, details of shading and of using highlights to what we call model form. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, meaning to make a three-dimensional sense of form. So if you zoom in, you see this amazingly dense overlay of figures riding elephants in a battle. And on a microscopic individual level, each element has pretty convincing aspects of three-dimensionality, right? The way the shield seems to go back in space, the way the figures move. But overall, there's so much packed, repeated detail, so much repetition of the forms, like the elephant's curves, repeated, that overall, you really are seeing more pattern than you are seeing the moments of depth. And so the pattern takes over and you see this as flat. Overall, it seems flat. Even if you go in close, you can see things that are not flat. Overall, that sense of repetitive pattern flattens that sense of depth. Brian posed an important question also because he's asking about the term form, which comes up over and over again in art history. And he's saying, can it be applied to an image, or is it only applicable when describing something three-dimensional like a statue? And so essentially, as Susan responded, artists can create an illusion of form, right, in a painting. And so my example here is our good old friend, the Mona Lisa. Literally, that's a flat surface. It's on a wood panel. And yet you see her form as having a solidity, suggesting of depth, suggesting that we have a three-dimensional form that wraps around in space. And that is a trick that Leonardo da Vinci plays with his artistic tools, using the blending of light and shadow, right? So the way he lays down light and shadow makes you believe that this has the round form of an arm bone and a hand when it's just flat paint on a flat surface. So let's circle back to color, because it's a really good demonstration of why we need these technical terms. Because color is amazingly complex and rich, and we only can fully get at that complexity and richness if we have terms where we can explain what it means that this blue, these blues, are the complements of these. Complement doesn't mean C-O-M-P-L-I-M-E-N-T, which means I'm saying something nice about you. This looks good on you. No, it's C-O-M-P-L-E-M-E-N-T, which means something more precise. It means that blue is the opposite of yellow mixed with red, because complement means complete. If you have yellow, you have red, that's orange, and you relate that to blue, now you've got all the primaries. So it's about the relationships, and you can only get at the relationships if you understand these components. And let me show you one last thing to say how amazing that is. So I just Googled Joseph Albers, a very important 20th century artist who devoted his entire life to studying the complexity of color. And his artworks are actually incredibly simple in some ways, colored squares. But what he's doing is he's studying how complex the interactions of color can be, because color is always in relationship to other colors. Here's his wonderful book on the interaction of color. You have a square and another square. Guess what? These are the same hue, the same value. They're the same color. Why do they look so different? Why does this look so much darker? Because of the color that surrounds it. That what your eye sees in a color is always in relation to what it's around it. So you have the yellow interacting with this color, which is interacting with the orange. Here, the same exact color is now presented on its complement. Blue is the opposite of orange, because on the color wheel, you have three primaries: yellow, red, and blue. You have yellow and red mixed together here, so blue is the opposite. Look how it changes your experience of the color. There's a kind of magic to it. Underneath all this science is magic.